Hello, everyone, and welcome to What to Do with Expected Compliance Issues at a Clinical Study Site, presented by Roe. I'm Jennifer Levin, contributor to Fierce Biotech, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Diane Tilley, Quality Assurance Service Leader, and Kristen Snipes, Project Director. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you have trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. Please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of this presentation. If you'd like to download the slide deck, please click the Resources button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions during or after the presentations using the purple Q&A widget on your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Diane, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Diane Tilley, and I'm the QA Service Leader at Roe. I'm a nurse practitioner, and attorney, and I have many years of clinical research experience. I'm afraid to say how many because it might date me. But I've had many roles in clinical research, study coordinator, CRA, auditor, with most of my experience as the head of QA, as the head of the QA function at multiple CROs.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kristen Snipes. I am a project director at Roe. I've been in industry for 19 years, so dating myself a bit. And my focus has been in the clinical and project management side. I've worked on both the biotech and CRO side, so I can understand the challenges that face us all as we move through management of these compliance issues. And we're excited to speak with you today. So just a quick overview of the agenda for today. In a second, I'm just going to give you a high-level preview of the two case studies that we're going to go over. We're going to move through then to discussion of stakeholders in issues of noncompliance. Diane will take us through reviewing the regulations, and we'll discuss when issues arise and apply some methodology for how to assess and bring sites back into compliance where possible. We will be reviewing two case studies in detail. The preview that we'll give in a second here, just as we move through the methodology, keep these in mind. And then at the end, we'll talk about when stakeholders disagree and how to manage all sides of your team through this challenging time. At the end, we're going to discuss just some conclusions and things that we hope you take away. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump right in. So as I noted, the cases that we're going to preview at the end here are one where there is an identification of noncompliance by the sponsor or the CRO at a site, and the compliance issue is concern over adherence to the protocol or GCP. And then the second case study that we'll be looking at is where the CRO or the investigator identifies actions of a study coordinator at a critical point during a protocol development and discussions on how to manage the compliance and remediation for that instance. Okay, so the stakeholders. So in clinical research, the end goal for all stakeholders is the same, and you can see here the stakeholders in the big buckets that I've listed are the sponsor, the CRO, the PI, and the FDA. And our goal is the same. We want to get therapy to patients, improve and advance patient care and treatment, while at the same time maintaining subject rights, safety, and welfare. And in addition to all of that, we want to ensure data integrity, quality, and execution of a well-controlled clinical trial. So there's a lot of things that we're all doing. And we have these large buckets here, but in addition to these sort of large groups, within each of these groups, we all have different viewpoints and perspectives and areas of focus. So for a sponsor, that may be the multiple programs or multiple studies within a program that they're running at one time. For a CRO, that may be multiple programs as well as multiple clients that they're managing. For a PI, his research may just be a small portion of his work and his clinic and his meeting time. Those are things that pull on him. So while this large Venn diagram looks simple, things can get complicated because we do all have overlapping roles and responsibilities. The small point in the middle is where we intersect and come together, but things can get complicated at certain times.
So we all work in a regulated environment when doing clinical trial work. And on the diagram, you'll see a list of country regulations that we all have to follow if the clinical trial is being conducted in those countries. So there are many, and they have overlapping focuses of subject safety, data integrity, well-controlled clinical trial, but the details can be different or additional depending on which regulations you're looking at. And this discussion is primarily going to discuss situations under the FDA regulations. In addition to that, it's important to keep in mind the ICH Good Clinical Practices and the implications of ICH E6R2. Regarding the PI responsibilities, he has increased responsibilities under the ICH revision, supervision of delegated tasks, training and qualification, management of any subcontractors, procedures to ensure integrity in the trial conduct at his or her site, and quality of the clinical trial data and source documentation. So at the end of the day, the data and source documents must be attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete, whether they're paper or electronic. The sponsor, as always, has responsibility and the obligation of oversight of the conduct of the entire clinical trial. The keys under the ICH revisions are quality management and the quality management systems as a risk-based approach, identifying critical processes and data identification, risk identification, evaluation, control, communication, review, and reporting all rests with the sponsor here. And evidence of oversight is important for the sponsor in all of these aspects. That includes subcontracting with CROs, use of computerized systems, and follow-up of noncompliance, which is what this topic is all about. In addition to that, it includes monitoring and approaches based on risk, centralized monitoring, and on-site monitoring. Documentation is also key in ICH GCP E6 revision 2. Risk management from the onset of the protocol development through the implementation of the trial. All of these are important aspects to keep in mind. So this slide presents several categories of noncompliance that one might see at a clinical investigator site, or buckets of noncompliance. It's not exhausted, but these are kind of the big buckets that you will encounter if you do any research at a clinical site. So in addition to these, there's IRB approval and communication, safety reporting, but the big ones are protocol compliance, data integrity, and source records at the sites. Number one is always subject right safety and welfare, and drug accountability is also very important for an investigational product that's not yet approved. And all of these, while there isn't a regulation about PI oversight, all of these relate to the oversight of the PI under the FDA regulations, that he must comply with all of these. So issues happen on a clinical trial at an investigator site. Noncompliance happens. So what's next? What do we do first? Who needs to be involved? When do stakeholders talk? How do you address an issue or issues? What regulations and what parts of the protocol are applicable to the noncompliance that you've seen? What are the risks? Have we done our due diligence? What documentation is there? Do we bring the site back into compliance, and how do we do that? All of these things are things that we're going to be talking about in this presentation.
So Diane touched on the word due diligence, which I feel like we use quite frequently in our industry. And due diligence begins really at the start, right? When you are beginning your study, beginning your program. And this can mean for CROs and sponsors, both selecting qualified investigators. And for sponsors, that also means selecting qualified and experienced CROs to support your programs. The same tenets apply to site selection and CRO selection. As a project manager, this is one thing that I see during study startup. We're very focused on timelines and moving quickly. And you really, this is a part with selecting qualified investigators that you don't want to rush. You want to ensure that you are having conversations, critically evaluating your PI and assessing their expertise, their ability to execute your protocol, and their knowledge of the area in which we're investigating. This is a step that's sometimes overlooked and often rushed, and by the time you get to an initiation visit, you're going to have to do a lot of remediation and training if you don't have the qualified staff. But even with the best laid plans, project plans, monitoring plans, and all those things in place, issues can come up. And when issues arise during the study, it's important to remember as we move through this talk that errors are not always misconduct. We're humans, we aren't robots, and we are going to make mistakes. So this is what some of the corrective action and ongoing training, things that Diane will be touching on and kind of diving into deeper, will occur. And so one of the critical parts here is this investigation, determining what the root cause is, can we bring the site back into compliance, and while assuring the safety of the subjects, the integrity of the data, and control of the study. And when you're looking at PI noncompliance, it's essential to understand that the red flags are identified and reviewed. And if you have a case for suspicion, if you do have a case that is suspicious, then it should be passed on to your appropriate colleagues. But it's very important that you ensure that there is an investigation as well as close follow-through for remediation as possible. So this is an overall process of just how we approach things, and Diane's going to dive deeper into this sort of circular path here of investigation and communication. But what I want to touch here is that the issue identified, the start point, could be any one of us. It could be the CRO, it could be the sponsor, it could even be the PI at the site who discovers something being completed in a way that is not in accordance with regulations by his staff. So there is an initial issue identification that can be done by any one of our stakeholders. And then there is a little bit of an investigation. Is this a non-compliance issue? Is it an error? How do we affect change on this, and what are the next steps? The next step after the sort of initial investigation is notification of the stakeholder. So notification, if you're the PI, to your CRO sponsor, notification, and that communication will change depending on who identified the issue at the time. Once there's a root cause and sort of an investigation and assessment of the situation, you move into the risk mitigation, which is that corrective action and bringing the site back into compliance. And if you can't, then we'll talk about a little later what happens then.
So a simple methodology for looking at how to assess an issue or issues that arise this is something I've used for many years, and it's not the end-all be-all, but it is a methodology, and if you don't have one of your own, then give it a try and see if it works for you. So we're going to drill down a little bit into this. And so first, you identify the issues, and that sounds so simple, but as someone who's been in QA for a long time, I get a project team that comes to me, and they're telling me the whole story from beginning to end, and sometimes I have to stop and say, what issue are you concerned about? What is the exact GCP issue? And it can be hard to sort that out with all of the facts and emotions in what's being brought forward. But once you identify the issue, then the facts and the story kind of fall around that issue, and it's much clearer to see. At this point, you may be investigating further to determine if it's an issue, confirming the issue, the significance and extent, and getting your documentation together. The next step in this is looking at the regulations. You have to know what's being deviated from in terms of the protocol, the FDA regs, ICH, or any other country regs that you're looking at. IRB requirements may not be followed. The 1572 may not be followed in general from a much higher perspective. So what is it that the noncompliance relates to? It has to relate to a regulation or a requirement of some sort. Then the analysis kind of combines those two. You look at the issue and the facts surrounding that issue, your investigation, your documentation, and you apply that to the regulations to come up and put an assessment together. At this point, you may be doing some root cause analysis and trying to put the whole picture together, the issue, the regulatory requirement, the root cause, and what the specifics are that you must look at, and in order to look at the risk and any plans that you're going to put together around that. And this all ends in actually the conclusions after all of these steps. Oftentimes it's easy to go from issue to conclusion without knowing the regs and doing your analysis to make sure that you're confirming that there really is a noncompliance issue that needs to be addressed, and addressed immediately for the reasons that Kristen spoke of. So what if you do find something and the PI's activities can't be brought into compliance? You've done your risk assessment, you've done your mitigation plan, you've taken steps to bring them back into the compliance, and it really is so significant, or safety is such an issue that you really can't do that. What are you required to do? I think the FDA regs are pretty clear in that a sponsor who discovers that an investigator is not complying with the signed 1572, the protocol, or the regulations shall promptly either secure compliance, bring them back into compliance, or stop shipping investigational product to the site and end the investigator's participation in the trial. If that ending the participation of the investigator actually occurs, there's a regulatory obligation to notify the FDA, and this is supported by the ICH requirements that are on the screen as well. So who reports the PI to the FDA, the sponsor or the CRO? I would say to start and look at this as to who holds or retains that regulatory obligation. Certainly that can be transferred to a CRO, just like monitoring or data management can be transferred to a CRO. And if that happens, then the CRO would hold that obligation to do that reporting. The best practice is always to think about this upfront at the beginning and define it in your contract in your MSA. If it's defined there, if there's any ever disagreement down the line, not that that ever happens or anything, you can go back to who holds the regulatory obligation and who's responsible for that. So whether the responsibility has been delegated to the CRO or not, what obligations does the CRO have in this situation? Always, always, always subject safety first. Address those issues of noncompliance at the site to protect the research subjects. Notifying the sponsor in a transparent and timely manner of the regulatory noncompliance at the site is key. Notifying the sponsor of the extent and significance of this noncompliance is key. Documenting all of the above so that every party has a clear understanding of who, what, when, where, how will help you down the line when memories fade and you have to rely on your documentation for this. So even if the sponsor most often does retain this responsibility, these are the things the CRO should do and must do when noncompliance is found. So what are the consequences of noncompliance? These are slides from the most recent slides I could find on the FDA website, and the resource and links to this are in your resources and references at the end of the slide so that you can view all of the slides yourself. But even if the PI notices his own noncompliance and brings a corrective action plan and reports it to the IRB and documents a CAPA, when the FDA goes out and they see that the investigator did not comply with the protocol, it's still a finding. It's still going to show up, even if they put a corrective action in place and found it satisfactory. So this is something just to keep in mind. This shows the fiscal year 2006, which is not a calendar year, by the way. So it doesn't represent a full January to December. It represents, I think, August through September, or September through August of every year. So these are findings on the left side of the screen are domestic clinical investigator FDA inspections. And of those inspections, what percentage had findings, what were the major findings when the FDA went to the site? And so as you can see, protocol adherence is the #1 finding, followed closely by source document and data at the site, what they're terming records in this slide. Consent, informed consent, that's subjects' rights, safety and welfare, drug accountability, IRB communications and approval. the percentages change year to year, but the buckets or the categories are pretty much always the same. On the right side of the screen, you'll see that these are official action indicated for fiscal year 2016. And of these, again, protocol, non-compliance with the protocol, the investigational plan is consistently the #1 finding when the FDA goes to the site, and they must take official action. And if you go and read any of the warning letters, you'll find repetitively on these that the investigator, they have multiple subjects who did not, who were went through the protocol, went through the visits, and consistently, protocol procedures were not followed. And so that is very important, and it not only relates to the trial and the data integrity and the well-controlled clinical trial, but it often relates to subject safety and investigator oversight as well, a lot of times over delegations. So in looking back at some of the clinical investigator inspection final classifications, so when the FDA goes to the site, how many times do they go to the site and inspect and take no action? No actions indicated. And in fiscal year 2016, 61% of the inspections resulted in no action indicated. 38% required voluntary action indicated, and only 1% was official action indicated. So overall, most sites are doing rather well. And so it's those instances when we see noncompliance that we have to intervene. So this slide shows the number of warning letters issued by the FDA in fiscal year 2016. And you can see clinical investigator resulted in 7 warning letters. Sponsors, which would include any CRO, should there have been one, were 2 out of the inspections for 2016. And you can see this data looks at information over the past several years. And this is part of the reason why we're doing this talk. We want to avoid warning letters on our studies and 483s if we can with our investigators. So this is what can go terribly wrong if significant and persistent noncompliance occurs and it actually rises to the level of scientific misconduct and what can happen. So not only can investigators get warning letters, they can actually be debarred from conducting clinical research. And this doesn't show the investigators debarred, but shows the numbers of notice, the NIDPO letters, which is Notice of Initiation of Disqualification Proceedings initiated by the FDA with investigator sites. So for example, 2016 doesn't show any NIDPO letters going out to investigators, but in 2015, 3 out of the 4 sites that, or 3 of the 4 indicated on the screen were undergoing NIDPO proceedings. And that's certainly what we want to avoid, and checking that one of our sponsors ended up on the debarred list.
Okay, so now we're going to move into the case studies, and we have the standard disclaimer before we begin. So again, these case studies are based on our actual experiences, but the details have been changed to protect the confidentiality of our sites, our staff, studies, and sponsors involved.
And to say it another way, in the style of a TV show, in the clinical research industry, the research is conducted and represented by 3 separate yet equally important groups: the sponsor, who is responsible for the clinical trial according to the regulations, the CRO, who is delegated sponsor responsibilities, and the clinical investigator and site staff who conduct the studies on human subjects. These are their stories. Although inspired in part by true incidents and FDA warning letters, the following case studies are fictional in nature and do not depict any actual person or event.
Okay, or we can do it motion picture style, which is the case study. In these case studies, all names, characters, and incidents portrayed or described in this webinar are fictional. Although the case studies were inspired by actual events, no identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, buildings, products is intended or should be inferred. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, so how do you look at these case studies? So Diane reviewed the methodology that we use here, and as she said, you may have one that you use already, and if so, that's great. If not, you're welcome to apply these. And these are some of what we're giving you now as the actual questions that we would apply to the steps. So during the investigation and the assessment, what is or what are the issues? And in addition to that, do you have enough information to assess the issue? And if you need more information, what specific information do you need, and how are you going to obtain it? And I think there's a difference between what information do you need and what information would you like to have, because I would like to have a lot of information, but as we all know in practice, we are not always going to get all the information we need. So we need to focus on what we need to make an educated decision at the time. You also want to identify, as a part of this exercise, what regulatory requirements apply, and then complete your analysis and present your conclusions. And I always would like to say, as a project manager, I think sometimes I find from peers and colleagues that there's a hesitancy to reach out to QA. And I think that it's good to remember as you move through evaluating issues of noncompliance, and Diane alluded to this earlier, QA is your friend. You should definitely reach out to them. And we'll talk about this a little later on, but at a lot of times we have relationships with our sponsors and with our sites, and it's nice to have an objective look at the issue and to help somebody have you step back and objectively look at things.
And to add to what Kristen said regarding that, sometimes we come in with a clean perspective and a clean slate and can see the forest for the trees that everyone is looking at. And we also have often counterparts at the sponsor and sometimes even at the sites that we can work on outside the study teams when emotions have gotten high.
So that's a great segue to communication between stakeholders. And so how should you communicate? Well, we think early and often, and in addition to communicating with the stakeholders, identification of the stakeholders is critical. If you think back to the Venn diagram where early on there was a very simplified look at all of the different stakeholders, but as we talked about and touched on, within those stakeholders, each has their own group. So within each sponsor, CRO, and even site, there's a QA group. We have our project teams, there are investors, there's IP supply, and so what you need to do is to identify who the stakeholders are across all of your parties, and to ensure that they're included in those communications, as well as the method of communication. Obviously, email is something that we all use, but it's not always the appropriate venue for communication such as this. Teleconferences at times aren't as well. Especially when you're dealing with noncompliance at a site, you're going to want to make sure that you're in person speaking with the PI, and those sometimes need a little bit more advanced planning to be there in person. And so effectively evaluating what is a teleconference, what is needed as an in-person meeting versus an email is very critical to ensuring appropriate communication. Then the risk mitigation and follow-up. This is the plan that you've identified for corrective action, and you're going to implement it, but you also need to measure how it's working and to ensure and to measure and to set parameters for how often will you follow up and how are you going to have evidence that this corrective action is actually working. And this is key to ensuring a timely response to bringing the site back into compliance.
And to add to what Kristen said regarding that, it's often a QA concern when corrective action plans have been supposedly defined and implemented by the site, but yet never really implemented, just defined. And so that follow-up and follow-through and documentation that they're back into compliance is really important. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the first case study. So this is a principal investigator who's a thought leader, well-respected, well-published in the therapeutic area. The sponsor always uses this PI for this indication, and on prior studies, the PI typically enrolls a low number of subjects. The sponsor has never experienced any GCP issues that cannot be easily brought back into compliance. The CRO has monitored this PI and site in the past as well. The study coordinator is often challenging to work with, but can get defensive when discussing monitoring findings, but there were no significant GCP issues in the past on the other studies, and the site could always be brought back into compliance. They have been inspected by the FDA without any 483s or warning letters. So at this point, we're going to ask you to answer a question we're going to poll you. So at the study start, have the sponsor and the CRO done significant due diligence in selecting the investigator? Kristen talked about due diligence at study start, and we'd like to ask your opinion based on that high-level summary of what you think. Okay, well, we have a nice split there. So hopefully we need maybe some more information. And Kristen, we have discussed feasibility studies. What else should we have put into that?
Sure. And yeah, I think what we presented was a high level, and I think depending on whether you answered yes or no, there's no evidence of feasibility in our summary there. There's no evidence of a qualification visit. So it would have been fair to say no, and I think what we were trying to present was just we were kind of making the assumption that, yep, we had done those, but those are steps that needed to be taken. But he's definitely qualified in the experience and with both the sponsor, the CRO, and the indication.
And so points taken. And so going forward, let's add to that case study and say that we have done our due diligence and they've had a site qualification visit. All of the I's have been dotted, T's are crossed, and everyone agrees that he has the time and ability to enroll, though no one really expects him to enroll very many subjects.
Okay, so here we are moving on with this case study. So we've had an investigator meeting and the site attended as you would expect. The study initiation visit went well, and the site has proceeded to moving to enrollment. What I'm going to do is I'm not going to read the slide to you, but I just want to highlight some of the flags. So if you recall, as Diane said, he is a low enroller, and all of a sudden we can see here he's an average enroller for this study, which is a little bit surprising given the experience we've had with this site in the past. He does have a few protocol deviations for out-of-visit windows, but that does happen. But the source documentation is adequate at this time. So really, the first flag that we see is just there's been a little bit of an uptick in his enrollment, but not anything that's causing too many alarms right now. So the CRA goes out for the next visit, and things get a little bit more interesting. So the PI has been out of the office for 3 weeks, and she hasn't returned. While she was gone, her appropriately delegated staff continued to manage the study, which that is great. There has been an increase of an additional 5 subjects while she was out for 3 weeks, which is now placing her into the high enroller category. So she has now gone from a low enroller to a high enroller, and in addition to that, we have a subject who was enrolled that didn't meet criteria, couple study assessments that are still out of the window for those 5 subjects, and then we're now noting some source documentation. So I think what I would summarize here is what we're starting to see is some consistent protocol compliance issues. And in addition to that, we now have some source document deficiencies and data issues that we want to address with the site.
So this is the next polling question. Again, it's just to have a sense of what you think the categories or the buckets of the protocol or the GCP noncompliance are.
Great.
I think we're all in agreement. And then the next one is do you think the GCP noncompliance issues are significant, persistent, both, or we don't have enough information yet? Okay. I'm not sure there's a wrong answer here because I think we do need some more information. We haven't answered all the questions, but it is concerning that they're significant and appear to be developing into persistent issues.
Yeah. Okay, so at this point, we all agree that we have some non-compliance issues identified, and so again, I want to highlight that we don't believe that all errors are misconduct, and again, this could be just a case of we need to retrain the site and address these issues.
And put a CAPA in.
And put a CAPA in place, yes. And so we've started clearly an initial investigation and assessment, and that is ongoing. What we don't really seem to have is a root cause. The PI, she was out of the office, so we do clearly have some follow-up with her to take. And then we also need to assess what additional information do we need at this time in order to complete our assessment. In addition to that, we need to ensure that we've communicated between the CRO and the sponsor to the PI upon her return, and then as well as between the sponsor and the CRO, so that we can ensure agreement and alignment with the issues of noncompliance, the CAPA the corrective action plan that we would agree to put in place, and how we're going to continue to monitor this site. And we'll talk a little bit about, diving in deeper as to what we would do. Diane will take us there in a second. So we also want to start that risk mitigation, which is bringing the site back into compliance with the CAPA, and then also ensuring adequate delegation and oversight.
So what would you do in this situation? What monitoring activities might you want to implement? And again, I don't think these are a little bit rhetorical questions, because it's not a live audience where we can take answers and discussion and still meet our timelines for this. But think about what situations you've had in the past and what monitoring activities. Would you limit enrollment? Would you increase monitoring? Would you put a site-specific monitoring plan in place? How would you help the site easily to come back into compliance, if you could? Again, this is in coordination with the sponsor, who has ultimate oversight and responsibility for the whole clinical trial. This is not in isolation for the CRO to do, or for the site to do on their own. What would you do if there continue to be these kind of issues after the CAPA was implemented? What are you going to do? Are you going to stop enrollment at the site? Are you going to let the subjects finish? Our subject safety, is that a concern that we now need to address? We don't have details or case study specifics regarding these. These are just things for us to continue to think about, because over the course of years in the business, sometimes you see CAPAs implemented and yet the stuff still seems to happen. So maybe the root cause wasn't right, and you need to reassess, or maybe it's a site that can't be salvaged. And then again, what happens if the decision is to stop the PI's participation and report the PI to the FDA? That's certainly a CRO sponsor kind of important discussion that we've already mentioned earlier.
Well, and I think to add to what Diane was saying, I think one of the other things to think about is that this PI went from a low enroller to being a high enroller, and depending on, and she's also a KOL. So yes. Depending on her workload and her ability to oversee these subjects, that's another thing to consider is, subjects were enrolled while she was out. Some clinical trials are very intensive with follow-up and treatment, and so you want to make sure that the PI has the time to dedicate to following these subjects and providing that oversight. So that's an additional discussion point that I think we've talked about as well, to be evaluated and discussed with the PI.
Yep, ultimately it's about subject safety and making sure that things happen in a way that protect their rights, safety, and welfare, and that you can actually use the data from the site. Okay, case study 2. This PI has been selected for this study, are well known from both the sponsor and the CR perspective. Used in a lot of studies in this therapeutic area, always a high enroller, has dedicated study staff, wants to participate in the study. The site historically, in both your and the CRO and the sponsor's experience, has the therapeutic experience, has the research experience. There's been no GCP concerns, no 483s or warning letters. Study staff has been stable and long-standing, experienced in clinical research, and the PI has always been known to be available and oversee the study.
So again, quick polling question. At study start, have the sponsor and CRO done their due diligence? Okay, and so, yep, we have selected, based on sort of the disclaimer we said before, we feel like we have selected a qualified investigator, assuming that all the proper steps were taken. So just this one is going to get a little more complicated. So, I mean, this never happens, right? You always have the same site staff from start to finish. Nobody ever changes in the middle of your study. But in this case, the study coordinator changed midway through the study. The good news is that the replacement for the study coordinator is a nurse with expertise in this therapeutic area, but the initial flag that we see here is that she is new to clinical research, which means that she's going to need some education training and some additional hand-holding from the team in order to effectively move into this role. And you can see here that we've noted the CRA did training for the study coordinator at the first visit following the switch. So at the first monitoring visit with the new study coordinator, the CRA reviewed, and again, I'm just going to highlight the flags for you, which is there's a few protocol deviations which required some retraining on the protocol and documentation requirements. And the key here is that although there were some deviations, she is receptive to feedback. And so she's once again retrained, and she's receptive to this feedback. But at the subsequent monitoring visit, the CRA notes that we're now having some data that is collected in a manner that is not consistent with the protocol requirements. And so therefore, she does have a discussion directly with the study coordinator and the PI about this. And the PI, who, as Diane has noted, is very involved, delivers very high quality, and that's clearly important to him. He is very supportive, right? So again, we have a very supportive PI. We have a very supportive study coordinator. We do have some issues that need to be addressed, and the site is taking steps to proactively address those with some additional training and oversight. Now we're approaching the critical path, and this is that we have an interim analysis looming, and so we are going out to monitor prior to this analysis. And when we get there, we notice that some of our issues have been resolved. The vital signs and labs are correctly being collected. However, the weight is still inconsistent. So here's where you want to start asking questions. Like Diane was saying, there was retraining and there were steps taken, and that retraining seemed to be successful for some, but not all of the values. And in addition, there were a couple other items that were noted. The study coordinator used an incorrect language translation for a questionnaire. So let's say she gave, in this case, the Spanish questionnaire to an English subject because she ran out of those questionnaires. And in addition, the monitor noted that a de-identified photo was being used to document the treatment site, and this was the photo you could tell was the same photo due to the mark, a distinguishing mole or mark on the site. So again, there's just more questions, errors, and documentation concerns that are arising as we move through this visit, and we have an interim analysis that is coming up. There's also some source data verification issues here, where we see that the urine results appear to be entered into EDC, but the documentation, the source documentation, seems to be correct, but it appears to be incorrectly entered into EDC. And then for some of our primary endpoints, there doesn't appear to be supporting source. So we do have a lot of questions at this point for the site and the study coordinator.
And so some of the questions I would say some of the questions initially are, why aren't they being captured? Is it because their innate medical records at the site don't capture these? Are the source document templates, do they even have source document templates? Or so as this brand new study coordinator not getting the oversight and support she needs from the staff. And so the next polling question was similar to the first case study. What category would you put this? I think we all pretty much agree. It pretty much hits every single bucket. So then the next one is this GCP compliance significant, persistent, both, or you still need some more information to make that determination?
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so again, we've identified non-compliance issues, and we need to begin. We've started an investigation because the CRA is on site and collecting information, and clearly we are getting that back to our project teams But we need to make an assessment, and Diane touched on some of the questions that you would be asking. Is it correct in a source and incorrectly entered in EDC? She is new to research. Does she not understand the systems that she's using? A lot of times with technology that we're using, not only are you needing to understand regulatory requirements and documentation, but then there are also different systems and tools. And so ensuring that she is trained and understanding of her responsibilities related to that, but also did the oversight by the study manager occur? So these are the questions and the assessments that we need to make, as well as to follow up with that PI. Again, the site is very receptive, very open, and so that conversation should continue.
And I would add that are these issues that the study coordinator is doing, is she making mistakes, realizing she's making mistakes, trying to cover up her mistakes? Is she intentionally violating regulations, or is she making mistakes and trying to fix her mistakes and making the matter worse?
Yeah. So again here, we've started our investigation. What still needs to be done is that we need to be notifying the sponsor, and again, circling back to the PI at the end of the visit with the issues that we found. And then again, further analysis and discussion as we get more information between the CRO and the sponsor, and then ultimately with the PI as well, to discuss the risk mitigation plan that we would be put into place. What else can we do to help bring the site back into compliance?
And the communication with the PI can be touchy at this point, because he's always consistently been a high-quality PI. Perhaps this registered nurse has been well-known, and he's used her many times in his therapeutic area and recruited her himself. There are lots of issues that make the communication between the CRO sponsor and the PI can be sensitive and needs to be considered, but still needs to be done. And so what would you do at this point? There are other situations. Is the PI over-delegating? Is he not around? What would you, as the sponsor and the CRO, consider? Again, these are kind of rhetorical questions, things for you to think about. Can there be a CAPLA implemented at this site is one of the questions, not just, not every site can be fixed. Is this a site that can be brought back into compliance? I don't think we have enough information in the case study to answer that question at this point. I think there's still investigation that is ongoing. In the meantime, what monitoring activities are you going to employ in terms of both remote, on-site, frequency, risk assessment? What are those areas that you're going to be looking at? Because it touched data integrity, your endpoints there's no source to support your primary and secondary efficacy endpoints at this site. So there are significant things that need to be addressed. I don't need to read through all of the questions for you, but these are just for you to put, to give you thought as to what you would do in your specific situation.
Okay, so as Diane and I have kind of said a couple of times, is that in these situations, emotions can can come out across all parties. For the sponsor, this is a product that they are trying to evaluate and hoping to bring to market. For a PI and a study coordinator, this is their livelihood. So everybody has a lot at stake in these situations, and so we felt like this quote from Thomas Jefferson was really appropriate. Nothing gives one so much advantage over another as to remain always cool and unruffled under all circumstances. And that's going to be hard to do in these situations. What we try to do is de-escalate and focus on the issues, and that can be hard. Where you need to, take a break and recognize that during some of these conversations and calls that it may be best to, terminate the communication
take a
time out, and then to come back to it. Try to keep it to identifying the issues while de-escalating the situation, and then setting an action plan with clear expectations. When people understand when they are going to be getting more information, or when they know when some follow-up is going to be coming, that helps them to feel more comfortable with progress. which is also hard because when you're doing these investigations, you're relying on other parties to give you information that you may or may not be able to get because it's out of your control as well. But again, just a quick, check-in to say, still waiting on this, or this is how much I followed up, so that they can see that, that due diligence on your part as well to try to bring things forward.
Frequent and transparent communication.
Yep. And again, communicate and be inclusive of all the stakeholders. Identification of key stakeholders, we touched on earlier, but this is another one. You don't want to inadvertently leave somebody out and ruffle feathers and cause them to feel like something was not being communicated to them for an incorrect assumption. So again, transparency and documentation. As Diane said, in these instances, your memory will fade, so you want to make sure that you are documenting the steps that you took, your notification and communication and plan as a team and a collective group that you put into place, the remediation, the follow-up, and then any additional steps, because somebody coming back and looking at this is going to need to understand what you did and how you got to the place that you are.
So lastly, we want to talk about some high-level tips and takeaways. I hope that you found some tools to help you through this, but due diligence before the study begins is always key. When problems arise later in the study, have a process and methodology, whatever works for you, for assessing regulatory compliance and risk. Before the study begins, agree who holds the regulatory obligation for reporting noncompliance to the FDA and the timing and responsibility around that. And then clearly defined communication and escalation plans, not just between the sponsor and CRO, which are probably more common, but think about it between with the PI and the site in mind. In the event that any issues or concerns on the PI that the PI notices, brings forward and wants to put forward to the sponsor or the CRO.
Okay, so with that, we're at the end of our presentation, and we're ready for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Yes, now let's move on to the Q&A. There's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We have lots of great questions already, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. First up, we have a question that reads, if compliance issues are flagged after study completion, what are the appropriate actions specifically with regard to the FDA?
I'm just rereading the question here. Are flagged after study completions, what are the appropriate actions, and specifically with regard to the FDA? I think it depends on the timing, because certainly you can, sometimes I've seen this addressed in the NDA submission, and so it all depends on the timing of when that takes place.
Yeah, and I think, again, that would be where, depending on how you're defining after study completion,
right?
If this is, at certain point, CROs and sponsors are kind of, work is being completed. So I think it, again, goes back, Diane, to your point about making sure that there's a clear understanding of reporting requirements, and then, however, if there are compliance issues, those would,
And oftentimes the sponsor has someone they're working with at the FDA regarding their submission. And so, again, I don't know whether you're talking about a database lock versus, versus much later.
Thank you. Our next question, with regard to FDA notification to end a PI's participation, what or how much information is usually provided?
I think you need to provide the same kind of information that you would provide almost internally. What is the issue, how it was identified, what the corrective actions were, and why you terminated their participation.
Okay. A lot of what you talked about today had to do with how difficult this can be. How do you keep emotions in check while going through these processes?
I think if you focus on if you remember to respect the people and the relationship foremost, and keep an even-keeled voice, and refocus on the problem as opposed to the, who's doing what. If you keep the focus on the problem, that is the best way I can tell you that it helps keep emotions in check and things from being escalated. But there are times people raise voices, people, want to walk away from the discussion, and sometimes, as Kristen said, you need a timeout to come back and regroup. Sometimes that's when perhaps if emotions have escalated because of the seriousness of the issue and even disagreement on the significance of the GCP noncompliance, you can take a timeout, or sometimes that's when QA to QA talk or regulatory to regulatory talk can often be almost like a facilitator in this instance.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what you said, which is, as a project team, those relationships are close, and so I think that's where the definite sort of having QA on all sides participate and be involved in regulatory is extremely helpful, and sort of bringing everybody back to the issue, keeping the focus on what the discussion is and the issue and how to correct that and to mitigate that, as well as looking forward to any, assurance that, we can prevent that.
Right, and sometimes those QA and QA discussions can happen outside of the project team, and then the entire team comes together and the discussion is facilitated by the sponsor QA or the CRO QA.
Thank you. Next question. Have you found that the move to electronic systems has helped or harmed your reviews and identification of concerns?
Helped or harmed?
I don't think it's harmed.
Yeah, no, I think it's like 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I mean, I think if you're as old as I am, it's sometimes easier to follow paper, but with electronic systems, there's lots of audit trails, and you can tell who touched what, when, where, and how. And so I'm not sure the scope of the question, but Kristen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think to me it's nice to be able to log into my electronic systems to get reporting, to see timely entry, to identify any trends and run reports on, hey, you can see some of these things before they, as they're occurring with some of the weights or things that, more didn't come to, missing weights or missing values or things that we wouldn't see until the paper was collected and entered, and there would be a lag there. So we can affect more and proactively look at data in advance of monitoring visits. And I think that is helpful in tailoring questions for your series and even for your data management and teams as they're doing their data reviews.
And I think in terms of that, the thought of risk-based monitoring comes to mind, and using the data from biostats and data management and having that rolled up and assessed would be of benefit.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next up, if informed consents are not signed at the start of a trial, should that be communicated to the FDA immediately, or should steps be taken to correct the problem?
Well, I think if you're talking about one informed consent, I think there's an interrelationship between the IRB, who has responsibility for that site, as opposed to going directly to the FDA, because I think there's the ability to consent the subject and determine whether, there are lots of things here about whether safety is a concern and whether they can continue, but sometimes consents are obtained inadequately and can be, I don't want to say fixed, but addressed in compliance with the IRB requirements. Kristen?
No, I would agree with you. I think, to me, as Diane said, the IRB, notification to the IRB, I think I would be looking at increasing my monitoring frequency and sort of, reaching out to my QA, hey, we're seeing this, and kind of thinking overall about a risk plan for the site and having those conversations before immediately escalating it.
Right.
Thank you.
Doesn't mean it won't be finding should the FDA show up, but it will be. But I think we would be working with the IRB and the site to bring them back into compliance to protect subject safety.
Understood. All right, it looks like we have time for just one more question. If your CRA is on site and suspects misconduct, what is your first step?
Have them call the project team and QA and discuss it.
Well, that's straightforward enough. Thank you, everyone. We had a lot of great questions today, and we couldn't get to them all, but we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. Thank you so much for attending the Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page you used to register for this event. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.